Welcome back. It's my great honor to introduce Professor Joe Stiglitz to you all. It doesn't need any introduction, but we're going to go ahead with the formality of giving one in any case. Joe Stiglitz is an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 for his contributions to information asymmetries and our understandings of it. But as we all know, in econ, he's done so many more contributions to the field that if he had not already gotten the Nobel Prize, maybe he would have, or if it was allowed to get more than one within a discipline, he would have gotten it again and again. Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University in 2000. He then joined the Columbia faculty in 2001, and he has been a university professor there since 2003. In 2011, Stiglitz was named by Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2024, he was named an honorary academician by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He has written a number of books. The latest one, which I really enjoyed reading, and I was hoping we would talk a little bit about today, but it's only slightly off topic, is called The Road to Freedom, Economics and a Good Society, People, Power, and Profit. And I should say welcome back, since you were a faculty member here back in the 80s. So thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to your remarks, and then we'll have some questions.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be back in Princeton, and it's a real pleasure to be talking about this topic, a topic that was sort of banned from economics for a very long time, but it's a topic that I've been involved in also for a very long time. The vicissitudes of industrial policy, it was very strong in the 70s. In Latin America, and I was involved a little bit then, went down to Argentina and discussions with ECLAC. It fell out of favor partly because there was when Latin America went into crisis, there were some people who blamed failed industrial policies, but that was a political agenda. The real reason for the lost decade in Latin America was debt and monetary policy, and it was industrial policies that were to blame. And my next engagement was with East Asia, which we've just had a set of very interesting papers on East Asia, on China in particular, but East Asia's success beginning with Japan and then Korea, Taiwan, mostly in the 80s, 90s, and then until today, industrial policies were a very important part of that story, I think. Interestingly, it was a very different story than the World Bank told about their success. And in the late 80s, Japan took the view that it wanted the people to understand how Japan had succeeded. And it offered the World Bank money to do that study. And the World Bank was not interested because they were afraid that it would come up with results that were the opposite of what they were telling countries around the world. But eventually, Japan said, you have to do this, and they gave them money. And I was the beneficiary, one of the beneficiaries, and we did a report that some of you may have seen called The East Asia Miracle. It was published in 1993 in a censored version. It was published by the World Bank, and they toned down what we had said, but it was still a very different view of development than was part of the Washington consensus that was dominant at that time. And then after that, I was involved with, well, at that same time, I was so fascinated to hear the papers today about China because right after the end of the Cultural Revolution, China asked a few people to come to China to talk about what should be their development strategy. And we went, they came here first to a meeting. This was organized by the National Academy of Science, and then we went there for 3 weeks to talk to them what to do. And I always, and it was, they were a broad range of people from Ann Kruger on the right to Ken Arrow and me. And I think I give China the credit of listening to Ken Arrow and me rather than Ann Kruger for their China success. And what we told it was very markedly different from what the shock therapist told Russia. It began to make its transition from communism to a market economy. And in all those discussions, industrial policy played a role, and I'll talk about it very briefly. And then industrial policy was in the Clinton administration, which I joined when I left in 1993, with dual-use technologies. So we talked about it in a very limited way. Just as one more part of my engagement on industrial policies, after I left the World Bank and left Washington, I had a long-term support from Japan, from the Japanese aid agency, to asking the question, how can the successes of Japan in industrial policy be applied to Africa? And so we still have that program going on, where we work very closely with South Africa, with Ethiopia in a previous government, and with other African governments to see whether those ideas that could be translated to other countries. And now it's a very exciting moment where the United States is trying to learn about industrial policies, and I do think that there is a lot to learn. I'm going to take a very high-level exposition. There aren't going to be any numbers or anything like that. Part of my interest, those of you know, I'm a theorist. I've managed. If I were starting as a graduate student today, I don't think I'd make it as an economist, because I avoided almost entirely numbers, except for one project I did with Will Baumol when he hired me as a RA in 1963 as an undergraduate. I was at Amherst, and he invited me to come down here as a pre-doc. So that's the only number, and it was on wine. And those of you who knew Will Baumol will know what I'm talking about. So anyway, that was the only numbers. I managed to avoid empirical work. So this is going to be high level, and I sort of apologize, but not a lot. And it's going to be about where does industrial policy fit into standard economic theory, and what can economic theory tell us about the conduct of industrial policy. So what I'm going to do is talk about how industrial policy has changed, that there are more objectives, more market failures to deal with, more instruments, and a better sense of what is needed to implement it well, and then finally a whole new set of worries about industrial policies and how one might deal with it. The broad definition of industrial policies is simply the interventions by government to affect what is produced, how goods and services are produced, or where they are produced. And it should be clear that when we use the word industrial policy, we're not talking about industry. It's a peculiar use of language, but and over the years, people have said we have to think of a better term for industrial policy than industrial policy, but no one has settled on a alternative. So I'm using the word industrial policy, but I just want to make sure that you all understand that sectoral policies, affecting technologies, but it's not about manufacturing or industry narrowly conceived. And as I said, it fell out of favor in the era of neoliberalism, in which there was a belief in the efficiency of the market. And there was a famous quip by one of my predecessors, or chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Mike Pascaline, which was, it doesn't make any difference whether an economy produces potato chips or computer chips. Obviously, that's not the view today. We are very good at producing potato chips. We're not very good at producing computer chips, and some people are worried about that. So today, that view, the view of Pascaline, is not widely shared. When I was at the World Bank, one of the interesting things, and one of the things I try to push there, and my successors pushed it even more, they were ambivalent at the time about industrial policy. And I thought that was very strange because the World Bank was an instrument of industrial policy. It was global industrial policy. So it took a kind of cognitive dissonance to be against industrial policy when you were doing it. But that's one of the great achievements of economists in that era. And what was particularly the case, that they were against it even as theory and evidence mounted against the efficiency of the market, of the unfettered markets. And one thing I'm going to talk a lot about is technology, innovation. And the standard theorem that economists use to defend the efficiency of the market, it's called the first welfare theorem, assumes fixed technology. It never addressed the question about whether economies are efficient in the production of technology, of innovation. And it should have been obvious that it wasn't, because knowledge, which is what innovation is about, is a public good. In fact, knowledge is a global public good. And one of the things that we know is that markets are not efficient in the production of public goods. So the presumption that there should not be industrial policies was just wrong. You know, as soon as you realize industrial policies are about the adoption of technology and development of new technology, you realize that the presumption is quite the other way, that you ought to have government intervention. The question ought to be how do you design it, where do you focus it? So it should be not whether you have it, but how do you make it work? In a way, one of the reasons that this hit me so strong is that knowledge, in a way, is a form of information, and my research in information economics had made it very clear that the markets were not efficient in the production, dissemination of information, and it was a corollary of that they would not be efficient in knowledge. So, as I say, the good news is back, but industrial policy is back, but with a deeper understanding of the market failures to help justify it. And I've listed here some of the market failures. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about innovation, but I want to emphasize that there are further problems when the innovation market failure lies on top of another market failure. And the obvious other market failure is climate change. Massive externality, and markets are not going to have an incentive to do the innovation if there's no carbon pricing, either direct explicit carbon pricing or indirect through regulatory mechanisms. And one of the questions that was raised in the previous session is, why did China get into green policies earlier and so strongly? And I thought, the discussion was exactly where I would have answered it, but at least two parts of that was the whole nature of the way the Chinese government had operated at the time. I'm not sure it operates that much now, but at least at the time, was trying to think forward. It wasn't doing detailed planning in the old Soviet style, but it was doing vision thinking. And particularly anybody that went to Beijing or other cities in China in the 90s and the beginning of this century knew that one of the things that was very clear is that they had to do something about pollution. And so it was both, so they had that vision of where they wanted a society to go, and they also have the means to make sure it happens. I was in a meeting with the premier, meeting with some president of Ford and some other auto executives, and he said, if you aren't EV within 5 years, you're out of our country. And he didn't quite enforce it quite so strongly, but he gave a clear message and clear sense of direction, and that gave companies in China a clear sense that there was going to be a market. If you think of the size of the market for EV, there's a discussion about what's happening in America about the market for EV. There's no question about what's happening in China about EV. And then there are other areas where pricing doesn't work very well. The markets are short-term, and I just mentioned how China was trying to have a long-term vision. But one aspect where markets aren't very good is pricing risk. And that's why we saw in the midst of the COVID-19, we saw how the lack of resilience of our economy. And if, analytic work that had been done before and after the pandemic had, in network economies, both financial networks, but also real networks, show that there are large unpriced externalities, and that the result of that is that without appropriate guidance, intervention by the market, you will wind up with insufficiently resilient markets. Some of this lack of resilience you didn't need to be a Nobel Prize winner to see when Germany got so dependent on Russian gas. Anybody who knew about geopolitics should have felt maybe Putin isn't the most trustworthy person to put all your eggs in that basket. And so I wrote in one of my books called Making Globalization Work in 2006 that it was very foolish for Germany to be so dependent on Russian gas. And the market just didn't price that risk. And more broadly, there is a value for national economic sovereignty. And it's a reflection of borders do matter. We had been creating we thought we had been creating a world without borders after World War II. And then with the pandemic, with Trump, we began to realize that borders are there. Every country is now realizing that borders are there. International agreements can be broken at will by a powerful country. And so national economic sovereignty for every country becomes a very big issue. And I don't have time to define what one means by that and how you measure it. But I think it's a very important issue that when you look at the returns in a particular project to industrial policy, you may be missing the overall value. It's not about one project or another, it's about the structure of the economy as a whole. That's what we're interested in, and the social value of that. There are other market failures. I want to mention a very important one is capital market imperfections. That some of the most important industrial policies involve a lot of money. And the development of the internet was an obvious example. And private parties typically don't have enough money to invest, to make the requisite investment. And some of these imperfections of markets, as my work and other people work, are inherent. You know, it's just not something that's fixable. They are really very, they are inherent. One of the implications of an important aspect of innovation is that innovation, R&D, comes up front. So you need to borrow money. And the other, there are two ways that innovation occurs, R&D, and the other was learning by doing, learning by investment. And optimal learning by doing, optimal learning by investment also entails making losses in the beginning, which you make up later on when you get the learning. So the point of this is that when you think about optimal optimal learning policies for a country, you have to take into account these capital market constraints. And so one of the things, this early paper that on industrial policies that I wrote with Partha Dasgupta was that it is not just learning. The infinite industry argument is not just about learning, but it's about the impact of capital market constraints. And that was one of the reasons why there needs to be a government intervention. I mentioned before that at the core, I think, of modern industrial policy is innovation. And the market failures are not just in the overall level of investment, but in the dissemination of knowledge. When firms do it, they try to create walls. You know, think about the difference. What would have been, how the evolution of our economy might have been different if the internet had been developed by one company rather than by the government and disseminated so broadly. It's also the direction of innovation. One of the things very clear, you know, what is the private sector focusing innovation on? One of the things is saving unskilled labor. You know, we already have enough unskilled labor unemployment. Why would you want to create more unskilled labor unemployment? Well, there's a market failure. Silicon Valley does a lot of innovation. What motivates that innovation? What motivates the innovation of Facebook and Google? Mostly, what is their business model? A better advertising engine. Is that really the main problem of our society, improving the quality of the advertising and the ability to target and exploit us? Clearly, I think from a social point of view, almost everybody would say more important is saving the planet from climate change. And this just represents another example of the misallocation of resources. And then there are questions about innovation strategies, whether you take small steps and large steps, and there is a proclivity of the private sector to take small steps. There are other problems where there are market failures that have played into our current political dysfunction, location, inequality, and then finally, not finally, but there are a whole set of problems of coordination and planning. So what I want to just give you a broad picture is that today we understand that there are a whole gamut of issues with which industrial policy needs to be concerned. And so it's not just, as sometimes people think, it's just, green industrial policy. Yes, that's addressing a very important market failure, the lack of the green transition, but we ought to think about it much more expansively. There is a changed perspective about industrial policy and a changed understanding of critique. It's not about picking winners. Often the government can do it better than the market, but it's not about picking winners. Of course, government doesn't want to pick losers either. But it's in correcting a broad range of market failures. That's what it's about. And with an understanding that government failures can, if you have a government that functions, be managed. And that's going to be, I'm going to come back to that when I come back to talk about the new worries. But one of the things I want to highlight is that when I said industrial policy is back, it actually never went away. We just didn't talk about it. It was as if it was an embarrassment because we had an ideology, but our behavior wasn't fully consistent with that ideology. So we didn't talk about it, but it was there. And an example of that is very early in the United States history. In the 19th century, the main industry in the United States was agriculture. And in the middle of the Civil War, we passed a very important piece of legislation, the Morrill Act, which set up the agricultural universities and the agricultural research and extension services. And there was a good reason why, farms are small, they can't do research on their own, so the government had to do the research. And not only did it do the research, it brought it to every farmer. And it was done at a county level. I grew up in Indiana, and we were very aware, which was at that time still a farm state, and we were very aware of the presence of these agricultural extension officers. So that was a very important part of the success of America, and part of the reason we went out of agriculture was we got so productive in agriculture. If we think of the other part, going into manufacturing, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, was a very strong advocate of industrial policy. And he created the First National Bank, subject to some controversy, but it was a development bank to promote the development of manufacturing, going beyond commerce, the simple commerce that was part of the financial system at the time. I always thought it was amusing that at Brookings, they created the Hamilton Project, And it was created by some people who actually didn't believe in government intervention in markets. But people who wanted, it reflected a belief. Hamilton had two aspects of he believed in fiscal rectitude, and that was the side they emphasized, but they didn't realize that he was a big interventionist. And so if they really had read all of Hamilton, they might not have called the Hamilton Project. They would have found somebody who just believed in fiscal rectitude. And in practice, industrial policy has continued all throughout our history, but within the Department of Defense, like the internet, and in NIH, in the area of pharmaceuticals, and the NSF, and many localities engaged in what might be called local industrial policies. And as I've already mentioned, around the world, there's been a history of, I think, successful industrial policy. But an important point that I would like to emphasize that hasn't been noted, I think, sufficiently, is that actually every country has an industrial policy, just some don't know it yet. And not knowing it is dangerous, because not knowing it means that those who know that there's industrial policy can shape it for their own special interest. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, every country, every government has to have expenditure policies, has to make decisions about infrastructure, education, where do you put roads, ports, what kind of education you give. You have to have rules by which the economy operates. Bankruptcy laws, competition laws. You have to have macroeconomic policies. And every one of these policies shapes the economy. And by shaping the economy, shapes what industries we have. And therefore, where the economy goes. So there is no way a country cannot have an industrial policy. So the example that I give, I like to give to illustrate this, is that we gave preferential treatment in the bankruptcy code for derivatives when somebody couldn't pay what was owed. The first claimant were the derivatives. That has consequences, because that means that if you write a derivative, you are more secure than if you were a worker, which used to be at the top of the credit chain. And so we were encouraging derivatives. We did it really well, and we had a financial crisis in 2008. So you can create a kind of economy which serves the interest of some part of the economy. So and every rule, and there may have been good reasons for having derivatives as the senior creditor. But the emphasis I want to say is that was a decision. It was made and nobody really knew much about it. That wasn't part of a popular debate. Should we do this? And the same thing when in the Childhood Indecency Act, we put in a section 230 that nobody debated, because who debates about issues about childhood indecency? Everybody's against indecency, right? But what was that section 230 that was never debated? It gave the platforms immunity from liability. And so that's how Google and X have become a free from accountability, a source of mis and disinformation that have polluted our entire atmosphere, information ecosystem. And so that's part, how these companies have grown so well because they have no liability. So that's what I mean by every country has an industrial policy, and every decision you make has those, and you ought to just think about it more carefully. So I know I've talked too long already, okay, well, let me go a little faster if I can. There are a lot more instruments. Once you understand the range of things that we have to do with industrial policy, you start thinking about the range of instruments, including the things I've talked about, but some other things: procurement, credit, joint ventures, direct subsidies, subsidies through tax systems. There are advantages and disadvantages of each of these problems associated, selection, incentive effects associated with each of them. One thing I should mention is that implementation is now viewed as a key issue. And we have, in the United States, had some very good institutions for implementing choice of who gets projects. They're not perfect. You expect failures. If you don't have any failures, it means you're not taking enough risk. A private sector company that never had a failure would be viewed as not engaging in sufficient risk-taking. So we actually have a good record of creating independent institutions. That's being destroyed now. We understand the importance of a continual process of review and cutting off failing projects, sunset provisions. Important thing is better contracts. When you do a loan, the government loses if it doesn't repay, and good contracts should get the upside potential, and we've done that sometimes, but often we failed. So the most egregious error was when we lent almost $500 million to Tesla and kept it alive. We took all the downside risk, but we didn't get any of the upside gain. One of the traditional set of instruments is trade and investment policy, and subsidies have been proscribed under the WTO, and except for agriculture, which was the rules were written by the advanced countries for the advanced countries. And I'll come to in a minute to some theoretical arguments that explain that played an important role in keeping developing countries in the neo-colonial trade patterns. The no subsidy argument was justified using standard models, neoliberal models, where there were perfect markets, no externalities, no learning, no risk. And in that world, you wouldn't want to have any subsidies. And so the intent, in some ways, was a good one. It wanted to create a level playing field, but it was, and the analysis that economists helped to support failed to note the importance of the endogeneity of technology. And that's really important because, particularly in the context we're talking about here, for developing countries, they wanted to catch up. And for advanced countries, they wanted to push the frontier forward. So my concern has long been that this rules-based system helped preserve traditional patterns which left developing countries producing primary goods and the value added going on in advanced countries. So this is the one newer theoretical work that I've been doing with Martin Guzman, and we've tried to create a global, a global general equilibrium with two countries, but in principle many countries, many goods, in practice two goods, but with endogenous learning by doing. The more you produce, the more you learn, and that lowers your cost of production. But there are two, the critical question that we pose in our paper is, concerns the global architecture of knowledge. How and where knowledge is produced, how and where it gets transmitted and used. And all of that entails real cost just as the production of goods and services. The older models, knowledge is transmitted just through trade, but this is less important in a world with global educational institutions and freer flow of skilled labor. And there are two important ideas that lie behind our model. Knowledge may be transmitted more easily across sectors within a country, particularly where you have institutions that are part of the way that knowledge gets transmitted. And some sectors generate more learning than others. So we have a two-sector economy, agriculture, manufacturing. Manufacturing is the learning sector. Make it very simple, very symmetric, a utility function, and two countries. So there's a symmetric equilibrium in which there's no trade. Even though there's free trade, you allow trade, but just no trade occurs. And but it's very unstable, and a slight advantage in one country in the manufacturing goods accumulates, and one country gets more and more productive, and the other country stagnates. And with a low enough discount rate, the other country always prefers autarky to free trade. And then there's a more general result is that global growth is actually, under certain conditions, higher with autarky than it is with free trade. So industrial policies which shape trade actually can be global growth enhancing. Okay, so there's some, 1 minute. There are new worries, and I'll just go through three, but no, I won't go through them. I'll just state them. The first is the fact, maybe two, the fact that if we engage in industrial policies, it puts developing countries at a disadvantage. In fact, Europe complains that they can't match our industrial policies, and they say it's unfair for Europe. So trade theory was about creating, in part, a level playing field. America's industrial policies has destroyed that level playing field, and the question is, how will other countries react, and where will that go? So that's one worry. A second, a related part of that is for developing countries, the old model of manufactured export-led growth model and the associated industrial policies that work so well in East Asia will no longer work. So from a development perspective, we have to rethink industrial policies, recognizing the new world. And finally, Trump's undermining of institutions and institutional safeguards obviously means that the political economy issues, the government failures that we know we need safeguards on have been totally undermined. And we have nationalism run amok without policies based on a reasoned understanding of the full consequences. But in conclusion, I think industrial policies are here to stay. There is learning by doing, learning how to do them better. We didn't do them openly, explicitly for a very long time. So we should expect, just like we learn better how to do, hopefully, monetary policy. And when we fail in monetary policy, like in 2008, when one of your distinguished former professors had mismanaged monetary policy and we had a financial crisis, the response was not to shut down the Federal Reserve. You don't say, well, just get rid of monetary policy. It was to learn from those mistakes to make better monetary policy. So my view is you need to have better industrial policies. When we make mistakes, when we give a loan to Musk without having the upside potential, well, in the future, let's make sure we get the upside potential. And there's the challenge of creating a fair global trade regime with industrial policies. I think that is a big challenge going forward. And finally, it's even a greater challenge of dealing with in a post-rule of law regime. But I have to say, if we enter that kind of regime, in such a world, there are a few safeguards against anything. So, why begin picking on this as something that you need to have safeguards against? Thank you. Sure.
I want to sit here and switch.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much. I am a development economist, so the issue you mentioned on the second to last slide was particularly distressful. That's actually the first question I wanted to ask you. What can low and middle income countries do if export-led industrial policy is not an option for them, if following the model is not, of East Asia is not going to work, among other things because of the nationalistic move.
So what I said is export-led manufacturing isn't going to. And the reason it's not is that manufacturing is going to be a smaller fraction of global employment, and labor content of manufacturing is going down. So the competitive advantage that they have for having cheap labor is going to go down. So what one has to do is, what I say, deconstruct. Why was export-led manufacturing such a successful development strategy? And it was because it simultaneously provided learning, and the learning you got then got disseminated to the rest of the economy. And when I say learning, I want to understand it in a very broad sense. You had to have financial institutions to have a good industrial sector, and those financial institutions, once you create them for the manufacturing sector, urban sector, they are also useful for the rest of the economy. So when I say learning, institutional learning, you create an educational system that you need for manufacturing, well then that has benefits for everybody. So it's a broad sense of learning. But it also gave you foreign exchange, created jobs, which are obviously very important if you're going to have political stability. So it did all those things in one sector. So my view is that one is going to have a portfolio of strategies embracing many different sectors. And it's going to be sort of, it's not going to be so crisp, but you'll have to have, agriculture will still be important for a long time, but you can still have a lot of learning. Some modern agricultural sectors are very learning intensive. Service sector, many of the service sectors are, they both create jobs and some countries, India has been very successful in getting foreign exchange out of them. So tourism is a big sector for some countries that have the right opportunities. So what I think it's going to be a much bigger challenge to put together a portfolio of industrial policies, it's not any single one, that do what manufacturing did. And that for some countries, big countries like Brazil, their domestic market is very large. So the big advantage of export-led growth was something that people here wouldn't remember, but 50 years ago when they were doing planning exercise and thinking about development, it was planning. The material balance equations were critical, you know, to make sure that you had enough demand for steel that would match the supply of steel. And so you had to solve the Laurasian demand and supply equations, and that was really hard. But what was wonderful about going into an open economy is you could produce as many TVs as you could produce, and there was a global market out there. So you didn't have to solve these difficult planning problems. You could just dump it on the market. And that's one of the big advantages that export-led growth had. But markets are working better, not perfectly, but in a large economy like Brazil, I think there's a lot of opportunity for industrial policy that is just oriented to making their own service economy more efficient.
But how about a small economy like Senegal or Malawi?
There is still potential for industrial policies that will make the service sector more efficient. You know, so you know, you don't think of them in traditional language of industrial policy, but you know, you ask why are standards of living lower in some countries than others? Well, people are less productive. And what industrial policies are about are figuring out how to make people more productive in everything they do. And the hypothesis of standard economics that knowledge just flows causelessly everywhere and everybody's at the frontier, it's obviously wrong. And so the question is, where are the best places for intervention? Where it will make the most difference? What are the barriers to learning? You know, it may be, you know, thinking about how I can remove those barriers to learning. And part of that is, yeah, I always think most about where are the big systemic effects? So where are there big externalities? So, you know, and that was captured in the title of a paper that I wrote with Bruce Greenwald, where we said we should be thinking not about infant industries, but infant economies. So it's helping infant economies grow, not infant industry arguments for protection.
I really like the fact that you started with a definition of industrial policy. It was on your first slide. And you mentioned it's about what is produced, how it's produced, and where it's produced. But you didn't mention who is producing. Then later on you mentioned, well, it's not about picking winners, but I think we all know that de facto there is always some winners and some losers inherent to any choice of which sector to focus on. And so should we expand even more broadly the definition of industrial policy to include things like thinking hard about reskilling opportunities, or like even it was mentioned earlier in a question, education and how we think about education. I think you
very
kind of
much
alluded
so.
to the idea that education policy is part of industrial policy, but it's not spoken as such.
That's right. No, that's where I said every policy is actually part of industrial policy. If you don't have an education system that trains STEM workers, how are you going to have a high-tech economy? Unless you import those people from other countries that train those workers, and then if you have immigration barriers, you can't even get those. So that immigration policy is part of industrial policy in that sense.
So we can add the who then.
Yeah.
That's your definition. Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things also as part of industrial policy, or in the design of industrial policy, is this difficult question of choosing which firms to get the recipients. And one of the things on the slide I didn't have a chance to go through, I always, but anyway, was that the advantage of the tax subsidies is you don't have to pick winners, which firms are going to be the best firm. They come forward. But the disadvantage is that you don't know how many firms are going to come forward. And in this particular case, and at least the estimates at one time, where the CBO, I think, estimated that was those subsidies were going to be like 300 billion, 350 billion. And some people are now estimating there'll be 1.5 trillion. So that's a big error in estimation, but it's just very hard because you don't know, you're doing something new and you don't know who will come forward when you come up with a new policy. On the other hand, the CHIPS Act was very explicit. They had to pick which firms to give it to, and that's always a question that's fraught. And we put in a lot of safeguards, but it's still, I think a lot of people were very upset that Intel got as much money. Because Intel, the argument is they had paid out something like almost $150 billion in dividends. And how can you say a firm that's paid out that much money needs a subsidy of $10 billion or $15 billion? It just was not credible that was the reason they weren't making the investments, that they weren't doing, if they weren't making small nanochips, it was because of some other flaw in their institutional structure that would not be fixed by giving them another $10 billion.
Maybe we should move on to questions from the audience since we're behind time. Okay, microphone. Okay, we'll start over here. And we'll take a few questions, I guess, all at once. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, did you have a question? No, it was the person behind, but you have a question?
Okay, a quick one. I'll take 1 second to say how happy we are you are back on your campus, old campus. Delighted. Joe, we heard a lot about China's prowess in so many things, right? Technology, manufacturing, and other spheres. So, obviously, they have their set of national comparative advantages. So, in today's world, given the rise of China, and we are trying so hard to, I don't want to use the word, but to not become number two, that what do you think the United States comparative advantages today, where they are, what are they? And if you were in a position to recommend industrial policies, what would you recommend?
Yeah, we'll take a few more. Yeah.
Okay, let me get it.
That's okay, yeah.
Do you have a piece of paper or half
Yes.
piece of paper?
Why don't you use this?
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. My name is Eugene. I do equity research at Jefferies. I thought one of the most striking insights from you today was that industrial policy has been always there. We just never talked about it. But at that time, in the past decades, we experienced the expansion of globalization, I think until 2020, I think we can talk about when the timing was. And right now, the industrial policy is back, and people are worried about what that could mean for the future of globalization. So I'm wondering what's different now and whether there are any lessons that we can learn from the past experience. Thank you.
And then last one. Okay, right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. My name is Sophie Meunier. I'm a political scientist here at SPIA. We shouldn't be surprised that China is good at industrial policy. It seems to be easier when you have a political system like China's. But in liberal democracies, who decides what industry needs to be prioritized according to what domestic preference? And how do you avoid political capture by particular interest groups?
You want to start answering? Yeah. I think you have your microphone down here.
Oh, well, I have it. Okay, good. So let me take the last question first. In democracies, we discuss, have wide discussions of alternative visions of the future. And one of the remarks I made earlier was we created institutions like the NIH and the NSF that allocate, that are engaged effectively in industrial policy, choosing which research projects are good, where we put our priorities. We have discussions about, about them. Congress will sometimes mandate, we want to have an initiative on this or that. And we try to have institutional safeguards, review processes. They're not perfect, but I think they have worked very well for long periods of time. DARPA was very successful. And I think that actually, over the long run, if we have a long run, democratic institutions can actually work better. The danger of authoritarian institutions is that you have the wrong authoritarian figure, and his power is concentrated in that one figure, and the mistakes are hard to correct. I think we have we have a system that is normally better at error correcting. And I say normally, obviously, once those safeguards get broken, and and political theory is about checks and balances, and we thought we had adequate checks and balances, and it may be that we don't. So I don't, and the problem of political capture is one that we managed reasonably well within DARPA, within NSF, and within NIH. So I'm not pessimistic in general about this issue of authoritarian. The reason why China has been more successful, I think, in many aspects of the industrial policy is related to some of the politics. By the nature of where they had come from, they took a longer run vision of where they were going to go. And, there is an advantage from being behind, because you want to catch up, and you can see where the immediate future, so that gave them advantage in catching up, but they studied, it was more than catching up, and that was one of the things that came out in the discussion in China. On EVs, they've gone beyond us. We don't want to admit it, but we need technology transfer from China if we want to be as efficient as they are. For all the virtues that Musk claims for himself, he has not done as well in innovating as BYD, and he should be open and start talking about himself as a failure in cars. The broader issue of what is dynamic, the old models of Ricardo about comparative advantage depends on your weather, the land, your endowments, don't fit the modern economy, where the critical things are dynamic, your innovations. And that makes it really hard to assess what your comparative advantage is. There was no natural reason, if you go back a little bit historically, for the Swiss to have a comparative advantage in watches. It's not like watches are easier to produce when you're in the mountains, right? There's no natural, but it happened, and there is, history matters in a lot of this, but part of what China saw as their advantage is long-run thinking as opposed to short-termism on the part of our corporate leaders, long-run finance as opposed to short-run finance, the education system, where the number of engineers that they have now is a multiple of those in the US. And now, as they have seized a larger and larger fraction of the global markets in many products, they have a larger market. With a larger market, higher returns to doing R&D. So they've created internally, a whole set of advantages, both in EV and on chips. And I talked to one of the guys who, runs one of the main chip companies outside of Taiwan. Does some of the design, and he basically says there's no way the CHIPS Act is going to make a difference in the global balance of power in chips. That it's just an unfair, with so many engineers and so many, the ability to put so much money in such a large market, they're going to dominate. And so that's going to be an important issue, and that's where national economic sovereignty becomes important. We may have to just say we may be inefficient, less efficient than they are, but we have to have our own capacity protected, perhaps, because we can't be reliant on many of these goods on China. One of the important things I wanted to raise in terms of one of the questions in the previous session was that protection on wind or on electricity in solar has ramifications for all the goods we produce. So if we increase the cost of energy relative, now solar and wind are the cheapest form of energy, if we have protection, that means energy costs in the US are higher, and that affects our competitivity in every other product. So you can't just think about the consequences of, it's nice to have energy independence in that way, but if you do it through protection, you are having further consequences for every one of your exports. And I don't think you want to have offsetting measures in all these others. So if you take that perspective, what that says is that probably better for the environment and better for our overall trade position is to have a subsidy. In other words, to say, okay, it's important for us to have national economic sovereignty, and we are going to subsidize the use of domestic chips. And, better for the environment that everybody buys cheap, uses solar, and it is not as trade distorting. So I think we have to, this is an important caveat about industrial policy. We have to think about the ramifications outside the narrow sector that we're focusing on.
I think
the other question on globalization, this relates to the other question on globalization, which is...
sorry, I've been getting signs for a while that we are beyond a schedule. So
okay.
Sum up in 10 seconds.
The future in 10 seconds.
It's going to be difficult.